Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Stephen Woolfolk. I'm the Director of Programming at the Kansas City Public Library. Thank you all for coming tonight. It means a lot to us. Before we get started, I want to offer one special thank you to my friend and colleague in the back, Sophie Williams. It was her idea to make this a signature event, and clearly that was a very good idea. So, hat tip on that one. So I was in the car with my son the other day, driving home from school, and I mentioned to him that I was really excited for him to be old enough to get out in the world and start exploring local music and discovering new bands on his own and with his friends. And I don't think he quite understood why that was so important. But for me, my exploration of local music scenes and my discovery of new bands was simply the means through which I was exploring the world. And I was discovering myself. From my first concert, White Lion in Hannibal, Missouri, not even Great White Lion in Hannibal, Missouri, to my first time seeing They Might Be Giants in Lawrence, Kansas, to following Bruce Springsteen on tour around the Midwest, to discovering Grace Potter in New Orleans and Government Mule in Austin, Texas. Our life stories in many ways are told through those live shows that we have experienced. Similarly, the story of our city is told through the live shows that have been hosted at the countless venues over the years. And that is the story that Cody Wyoming is here to share tonight. From the arrival of the first piano in 1850 to the thriving 1920 and 30 jazz scenes to the emergence of punk rock and the contemporary music scene, Wyoming has been in dozens of bands over the years and today plays with the Philistines, the Pedaljets, Cody Wyoming The Deal, and the Guillotine Choir. Recently has turned his attention to researching and cataloging Kansas City's rich musical history. Tonight, you will be among the first to share in the fruits of that labor of love. Please welcome to the Kansas City Public Library, Mr. Cody Wyoming.
All right. Well, thank you very much. This is very nice to be here. I'd like to first off thank the Sin City Disciples live at the Middle East in 1990 for that extraordinary set that they pulled off. I wish I had been there. I was not. But if anybody in this room got the chance to see the Sin City Disciples back in the day, it bordered on a religious experience, and that was one of those nights that was captured there. And so I feel a little, I got the blood moving a little bit. So, okay, so this is odd for me. I'm not used to being in front of people without a guitar in my hand for a long, long time. So I got some pictures here, and I'm going to try to go back and forth between putting these pictures up and going through the thing that I wrote. So pardon me if it's disjointed at points, but here we are. So here's how it all started. I can't remember exactly where it first hit me, but I know that one night in the 1990s, over a bottle of whiskey, someone who I must have respected a great deal at the time told me the story of Big Joe Turner and how he invented rock and roll in Kansas City. And that not only was it not Elvis, but it was also not Chuck Berry, and it wasn't Little Richard either. It didn't come from Memphis or New Orleans or Macon, Georgia. It came from Kansas City. At the time, some people called it the Kansas City Stomp. This led to a few decades of late-night drunken boasting that I could prove that rock and roll was invented in Kansas City. And, well, eventually I just sort of I started collecting more pieces of that story and piecing them together until a few years ago, I sort of asked myself if what I had been saying for all these years was even true, because most of it was based on the late night drinking and talking with musicians that I knew. And so I went looking for those answers, and I found them, but the answer was much more revelatory than I had expected. Kansas City was a bigger player in all of the music of the 20th century, and slowly shaped itself into what I'm calling the Kansas City sound. This project started shaping itself into what I'm calling the Kansas City sound. I wanted it to be a conversational journey where I learned about this music and this music scene that I'm also a product of, but its roots and how it grew. And so it was an interesting thing to try to turn this into I guess a lecture is the right word, but to where I'm speaking directly and maybe not didactically, but I'm presenting as opposed to being a part of the conversation, which when I do get the podcast rolling, it is very much more a conversation. I'm talking to people and I want to learn about these stories as I get through them. But it turned out that the history of this place is responsible for some of the most important music of the 20th century. And when Sophie graciously asked me to come here and talk about the history of punk rock in Kansas City, I said yes right away, and almost just as quickly discovered that I wasn't going to be able to do something as simple as that, and there's just way too much missing context. The story of KC Punk and underground music is a chapter in a much bigger story, and that story shook up the world. And so my apologies up front to the fact that I'm straying from the assignment a little, but tonight's going to be a bit of an introduction into the Kansas City sound, whether it's a podcast or a book or whatever I end up doing with all of these stories. This is kind of a broad overview of that entire story that I've been trying to find a way to tell. And I'm going to make punk and underground music the center of tonight's focus. I can tell you right now that we'll be taking a circuitous path to get there. But back to punk for a second. First off, what do we mean by punk? And that is a question. There's not many less punk rock questions than coming into an academic setting and saying, what is punk? That's about the least punk as fuck thing I can think of to do. But so, like, what does punk rock mean? Does anybody have any, just go ahead and shout it out. Anything. What's punk rock mean to you? Anybody?
Sticking it to the man.
Sticking it to the man? Yeah, right on. Anybody else? Rebellion.
Wow.
Exceed playing in the rain. Standing in a rainstorm with a microphone.
That's fantastic. Right, and I heard community. I heard rebellion. I heard a lot of the stuff. What's that?
DIY.
DIY. Yeah, that.
Ad-libbing.
Ad-libbing. Going for it.
Against the machine.
Raging against the machine is certainly chaos. Chaos, anarchy. Yeah. Yeah, man. That's definitely all a part of it. So very broadly, I've always kind of looked at the answer to the question of what is punk as a concept is a way of doing things without regard for gatekeepers or institutions or establishment. Not the music business, not the clubs, not the promoters, nobody. If you want to do a thing, you do the thing. You find your people to do it with, the people to do it for, and then you find a place to do it in, and you just do the goddamn thing. Whether it's a rock show, or a play, or an art opening, or whatever. Poetry reading, you made it happen. You didn't even let your own complete incompetence or inability to do the thing deter you from doing the thing. Frequently, you did it in defiance of some person or entity who would quite frankly rather you did not do the thing. So for a lot of people, the world over, I got a hip crowd. I think I know you people know what's up. But for a lot of people, punk can mean a lot of different things. It can be very superficial. It can be a fashion. It can be a fairly specific music genre that lots of people can argue about what the parameters of that music genre are and do all the time. I know that there are still punk rockers. I know that things have fractured and things are different. There's no monoculture, and the sort of I don't know if I'd really call them cliques, but subcultures that I used to belong to have splintered and fractured, and now there's less of that sort of thing going on. But there's rockabilly people. There's greasers, and then there's punk rockers. There's belly dancers. There's things people have found a thing, and they've decided that that's one thing that's been interesting as my generation has grown up is like we didn't have to stop being the things we were at 30. We just kept on being it, and so did everybody else. And some people, are anime characters into their 60s and 70s. Fucking great, Whatever gets you through the night, I am all for it. So in the 80s, as an example, there were fairly strict sects that people belonged to and identified with, and still other people who refused categorization, which is punk as fuck. But back then, the music you listened to really defined you. And there were jocks and preps who listened to top 40 radio music, and metalheads or heshers who listened to heavy metal and some classic rock. There's shit kickers who listened to country. And at my high school, you know, which is really where all of these things were the most important things, there were the punks. Some who identified as punks and some who identified as other things. Now, for the sake of authenticity, which is the real soul of credibility in punk, capital P, I need to be clear that I was not ever a punk. Strictly speaking, I didn't even really listen to that much of what people would call punk. I was more into post-punk, death rock, new wave, and where I grew up, punk was a catch-all term that was applied by others to describe all of us kids who were into weird or underground music. And there weren't very many of us in the mid and early 80s. Like a little more than a dozen kids at my high school, even as late as 87 and 88. There was 17 or 18 of us in a school of 3,000 people. There was like 6 black kids, a dozen or so punk kids, and then a bunch of rich kids and a bunch of shit kickers. And I apologize if you went to high school with me and you're identifying and you're not recognizing, but that's the way that shit was. Park Hill. I went to Park Hill when it was just one school, and at that time, nobody I knew described themselves as the word goth. Goth had been passed around as a sort of musical subgenre. The people who listened to it were generally called death rockers, which was its own subgenre that is sometimes called goth, but is actually goth adjacent. And jocks and metalheads and the shit kickers, they weren't concerned with our little differences. Are you following me? So while I was one of the punks, I wasn't really a punk. I was more like a new waver. I wore eyeliner. And we were all just lumped in together. We had overlap with each other. We had more overlap with each other than we did of those larger groups. We were a minority that was looked on with suspicion and derision and frequently treated with violence and terrorism, usually manifested itself as one or another sort of homophobia. The bullies who liked to prey on my people often did so to the tune of homophobic slurs, and that's mainly to this day, as a straight man, why the gays are my people and have been my gang, and I am the Q in LGBTQ because of that. So yeah, punk. I first learned about punk from the Southern Baptist Church in Enid, Oklahoma. This is true. The Sex Pistols were in America, and I was 6 years old. And did you know that they vomit and urinate on their audience? They rape and sodomize people in the audience, and they were going to be just 115 miles away in Tulsa. The panic. Our very way of life was at stake, and this was a regular part of several Sunday sermons for several weeks in the winter of '77. Punk rock was here, and it was going to corrupt and defile our very way of life. I was 6 years old, and I will admit that it was a little scary seeing Johnny Rotten and Sid Vicious in these news clips. And but it illustrates what a different world it is now. Secular rock wasn't allowed in our house until I was around 10 years old. We got sucked up into the church. That's a whole other story. We moved back to Kansas City, and we got out of the church, and I was a little young, and I was also really, really sheltered from the first wave of punk when it happened, because I didn't get much of that music until 1980. I started reading and learning about it, like I was doing with all music. Now that it was no longer forbidden, I was just taking everything in. Everything that I could, classic rock, prog rock, punk rock, like it was music, it was food, it was nourishing me. And I was feasting. Punk was still very exotic. It was very scary. It was very far away. And then in the 8th grade, in 1986, 85, a 6, a friend of mine gave me a tape of a band called the Orange Donuts, or the ODs, as they were known to many of their friends and fans, not without good reason on occasion. A friend gave me a tape of the ODs, and they were punk, and not only that, they were from Kansas City. Their guitar player was a madman, Kurt Witt. If anybody in this room knows Kurt, there he is right there. He is absolutely a legend. This time it was much more exciting than scary. I started record digging and discovering British post-punk music like The Cure, Bauhaus, and Joy Division, and was getting a retro education on punk. CBGBs and the Ramones and the Dead Boys, as well as the Sex Pistols and the Damned. But it was still untouchable. It was very far away. There was X out in Los Angeles, and there were other bands who were starting to pop up, like Fishbone from Los Angeles. I knew about the Outhouse in Lawrence, and that bands that I loved were coming there. The Outhouse. I think we get there. If I don't, I'll come back to it. But I'd not heard of anything happening in my hometown of Kansas City apart from that Orange Donuts tape. I was just too isolated. In fall of 1988, I put on a leather jacket. I hopped into my 1973 Dodge Dart to pick up my friends Rob and Gary, and we set out from the hinterlands of Parkville to cross the Broadway Bridge, which cost $0.25 at the time. And as a suburban 16-year-old from way north of the river, this alone was moving towards risky and rebellious behavior. We were just, like I said, we were just recently pretty evangelical. My parents were fairly phobic of urban environs, and I was not to go downtown at night for any reason, but I manufactured some sort of believable and reasonable whereabouts and set out for the crossing anyway. Not that I was a rebel, but I was not going to be deterred from my mission, and that mission was to see my first all-ages show. I'd been listening to underground music since I was about 12. I even had my own punk band, but we only ever played at friends' parties, and before then I really wasn't even aware that people in my town were making it or doing the thing. There were other bands at my high school, but they weren't punk bands, and we weren't exactly selling out the house at the house parties we were playing. So I thought we were an anomaly. I was sheltered. I just didn't know. Up till then, live music, concerts were, I'd seen some amazing concerts. My mom took me to some wonderful shows, but they were big. They were great big shows. Neil Diamond, Tina Turner. I got to see Cheap Trick, and REO Speedwagon, big show business shows. And locally, the band The Rainmakers, some of you probably remember The Rainmakers, had recently had a hit on MTV, and they were enjoying some very mainstream success, but that was big time stuff. That's not what I was doing. The tapes that we were making did not sound that clean. I knew about a few metal bands, and I knew that there were clubs where metal bands were playing, but that was because the bassist for one of them was the coolest guy in my school, and so we all just knew what he was doing because that's what you did. But punk, as far as we know, it came from New York or LA or London, and as far as I knew, it might as well come from outer space. I knew that punk bands were coming to town and playing the VFW. Here we go. The VFW. Come on, click. There it is. Still not very good. But yeah, that place right there. Let me find my place again. The Fool Killer Theater and the Outhouse and the Bottleneck in Lawrence, and I just had no idea there being anything resembling a local scene. I didn't know that just across that bridge there were all-ages shows that I could get into. So we did. We crossed the bridge, took a left, cruised into what is now the River Market District. At the time it was called the River Key, and it was literally a bombed-out ghost town. More on that in just a minute. We drove to 3rd and Delaware. We found a place to park, got out, followed the crowd of exotic-looking, relative to where we'd come from anyway, people, and we made our way up to the 3rd floor. It was a loft, one big open room filled with kids, punks, new wavers, skinheads, death rockers, skaters, hardcore kids, art kids, gay kids, weirdos, and other assorted misfits that looked like they would have gotten their asses kicked at my school too. Maybe not the skinheads, but the point is, these were my people, the kind of people that I'd had to eat a lot of shit because I was like them. I was different, and for the first time in my young life, I'd found some place where I immediately felt like I belonged, and some of the people that night would later become some of my closest friends to this day. There was a guy wearing a sort of like a burgundy Army airborne beret behind the board running the PA, and it turned out that his name was Paul Malinowski. And decades later, he would become my record producer, one of my closest friends. If you've seen a local show, he probably ran sound for it in the last 20 years. I only found out a couple of years ago when we were reminiscing about our early days, and I told him my first punk show and described the sound guy. He's like, yeah, that was me. That was, yeah, I had that hat. I wore that hat for like one summer. It was really embarrassing, you know. That was my loft, that was my PA. There was a band whose name I can't recall on stage when we walked in, but Nine Lives was up next. Nine Lives, who was fronted by a guy named Steve Tulipana, who now owns a place called The Record Bar. He just sold out 3 nights there doing the David Bowie tribute. And so he's still a very active person, but this was 1988. And Nine Lives was coming on. And they were who we'd come to see. We'd heard they were from Liberty. All right, for crying out loud. And they came on and they played their set, which included an irreverent and ragged cover of George Michael's Faith that was actually a big hit on the radio at that moment. This wasn't looking back. It was a big hit right then. And the rest of the set was furious, and we were knocked out. And if Liberty Kids could do it, then so could we. And then came the headliner whom we'd heard about but didn't really know, and they were from St. Louis, and they were called Ultraman, who have started playing again. Ultraman is doing shows again, and I had to miss theirs because I was out of town, but they were here just a couple of years ago. The show was a mess. It was profane. It was offensive. It was pummeling, and it was glorious. I got into my first pit. I got my first bloody lip that didn't come from a bully. I tried to show it off as best I could for the entire next week. And so began the first night of the rest of my life, and I've spent the majority of the years between then and now playing in more bands than I could even possibly count or remember. And I've made friends and connections, and I've paid attention, and I've stayed up late, and I've listened to the stories, and I paid attention, and I saw as many people as I could possibly see, and I paid attention, and I stayed up late, and I drank whiskey with people of questionable moral character, and I paid attention. And live music has been my life, and Kansas City, for the most part, my home. And I've toured most of the United States in a smelly van and slept on cold floors to wake up being cuddled by my keyboard player for warmth. I have seen every angle of the rock and roll lifestyle cliche up and close and personal, and I paid attention. And I've played in music in dozens of cities across the country, and I've seen bands from all over the world. And I can tell you with authority and objectivity that Kansas City holds its own with any of them, and it always has. And this is nothing new. Yeah, thank you. This is nothing new, and it's the bigger reason of why I came here tonight. Let's see. I'll start here. Just kind of see where we go from here. I'm not great at this part of it. I'm still kind of. Pardon me as I jump back and forth between the visual presentation and the words. So this is nothing new, and it's the bigger reason why I'm here tonight, is that Kansas City has a rich musical heritage that is as responsible for shaping the music and styles and tastes of the 20th century of the world as much as Memphis, New Orleans, and Chicago, and may even be more important in its early stages than New York or Los Angeles. And now, in order to get to that night in 1988, and to talk about the years between then and now, we have to talk about some other things first. First, we have to talk about cowboys, in the cowtown and the brothels that they visited. We have to talk about machine politics and political corruption. We have to talk about prohibition and gangsters and the mafia and racism and redlining, the Greenwood Massacre in Tulsa. The music that came out of Kansas City could only have come out of Kansas City. The soil had been fertilized in a way that was just peculiar enough that it produced something unique, distinct, profound, and actually earth-shaking. Now I'm condensing here. This is a heavily abridged version of the story that I've been working on telling for the last few years, and I'm unfortunately going to skip over entire decades and eras of Kansas City music, not because they're not important, but because there simply isn't the time tonight to talk about it all. I only have time to simply mention that the first piano arrived in Kansas City by a riverboat in 1850. This is still a few years before the upright piano became a innovation in the way that people consumed music. As I said, I lost my place. But the first piano arrived in 1850. But in the late 1800s, the innovation of the upright piano would change the world mostly because of sheet music. And I'll just briefly glance over Kansas City's history as the world's most important sheet music publishing town in the country. We had loads of publishing houses where most of the sheet music was made, and people came here to pitch their songs to people who made sheet music. Before the advent of recorded music, sheet music was how popular music spread and was consumed. Somebody would write a song, get it to a publisher, they would sell the sheet music across the country. Singers and musicians around the country would then perform these tunes. But also many had homes and had a piano, or someone in your family or on your street or in your building had a piano. People would gather around to play and sing the latest hits along with whomever their best sight reader was. Again, there's an idea of community in this. Families gathered around the piano playing songs that they'd never heard before was a common practice and a good solid time, or a solid good time for a Friday night. KC was home to some of the biggest publishers in the country. It produced a song that many people claim to be the very first country song ever written, a song called "The Letter Edged in Black" by a woman named Hattie Nevada. It only exists in its original form in sheet music. There are some people that have done recorded covers from it, but sheet music is where it's at. That's a whole world that when I do a podcast, I'm going to have to spend 6 episodes just talking about sheet music and what it was all about. But we're just going to jump right ahead, and we take you now to the proverbial Old West. To one of the biggest cow towns in the country, and due to its central location to the rest of the country and the recent installation of the first railroad bridge across the Missouri River, and therefore, which is what changed. St. Joe was a bigger town than us. St. Joe was kicking our ass. And then they put the BNSF railroad bridge across the Missouri River in Kansas City, and St. Joe has never recovered. My family's mostly from St. Joe. They know this. I'm not talking shit on them. The town has just hasn't bounced back from losing the bridge. It never has. I love, but you know. So the railroad bridge across the river, and therefore the only way to Kansas City was the only way to the frontier for several decades. Kansas City was the cow town. Cowboys drove their cattle from all over to stockyards to take them to all points, northeast, west, and south. And anybody who's ever seen a Western knows that cowboys are a rowdy bunch. Several weeks in the saddle make a man mighty lonely and fairly ornery, and cowboys were paid on delivery. They were usually young men who'd been alone too long with a bunch of fresh money in their pocket in the big city and out for a wild time, and this more often than not meant brothels, of which Kansas City had a bounty that was rivaled by almost none. Brothels were not strictly legal, but this is where the corruption that we'll be talking about in a little bit starts to come into play. A brothel could generally operate through a few different types of licenses or bribes. One of these was a dance hall license, an artifact that, interestingly enough, still existed. It might even still exist. until a few years ago, I know some people that have tried to open a club. It's been about 12 or 15 years ago that got busted by the dance hall license and had to shut down because they didn't pay their thing. Well, that dance hall license originally was a kind of graft to where a place that was a brothel could generally operate through a few different types of bribes. And an artifact, let's see, when it was used to close down all ages venues who hadn't applied for their dance hall licenses, what I was saying. At this time, the license was a fee you had to pay in order to have live music and dancing in your establishment for the entertainment of your patrons. So patrons could come in, meet a girl, dance, and then move on to one of the back rooms for further entertainment. A brothel had to have live music to keep running to keep its dance hall license. This was, in most cases, a piano player. And consequently, Kansas City became a piano town, as Kansas City was one of the biggest cow towns. It was full of these brothels, and these brothels had to have a piano going at all times while in operations. And like any other business, they were in competition with each other, so they began to attract and recruit the best players. It didn't take long for the best players to start coming to KC looking for work. Lots of these players settled here. They had families and started looking for work outside of their regular nightly gigs. So many of them took on students, and it didn't take but a generation or two to develop a formidable talent pool that way. The Wild West heyday that was once the jurisdiction of famous lawmen like Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson gave way to the 20th century, and the economic and sociocultural landscape of KC soon changed significantly. And not long after World War I, a man named Tom Pendergast became the political boss of the Kansas City Democrat machine. Pendergast had almost total control of every agency, business, and institution in Kansas City, and it was his policies that would have the most direct effect on what happened to Kansas City through the 20th century. You begin to see he took over most of the prostitution, most of the racketeering. He was getting kickbacks from the dance hall licenses. His policemen were also intentionally underpaid on purpose to encourage their taking of bribes in the local saloons and brothels. And any number of other criminal enterprises. A portion of these bribes was kicked upstairs to the boss. In classic organized crime fashion, the boss got to wet his beak. A couple of dollars from the cop on the beat doesn't sound like much, but a few bucks from a couple of hundred cops and other officials, it starts to add up pretty quickly, becomes a pretty neat and tidy business. Boss Tom had no time for prohibition, and pardon me for being really reductive here, but I do want to get to the music, but this is a super complex part of the story, so I'll be skipping over some more important details. But to make a long story short, Boss Tom basically ensured that prohibition didn't happen here. He was making way too much money to let the feds shut the gravy train down. He trained his cops and built this machine to involve a complex system of bribery and other shenanigans that allowed the bars to stay open and the liquor to flow. Kansas City was what they called wide open. It was around this time the city acquired its nickname, the Paris of the Plains, because it had a powerful anything goes ethos about how it worked and how it played. Tom owned saloons, and he sold whiskey in them. And he knew that he needed to keep people in these saloons buying his hooch. And the way he did that was by encouraging live music. Now, he didn't know shit about live music. So he left it up to the people making music just to keep making whatever music keeps them buying that whiskey. And there were hundreds of saloons, and Tom didn't own all of them, but he got a piece of all of them. The town was heavily segregated. It was redlined. And the black clubs on the east side of town became havens for wild, innovative, original music where musicians challenged each other to become better because they could. They had the freedom to do so. The work was steady, and nobody was breathing down their necks about what to play except for the band leaders. Again, that is another story, too. All these saloons and dance halls needed players. And again, it didn't take long for the word to get out that if you were a musician and you wanted to get somewhere, you needed to get yourself to Kansas City. Other cities attracted that talent as well, like Chicago. But if you wanted to have fun while you made music, you needed to do it in Kansas City. Speakeasies in Chicago and New York were always in danger of being raided and shut down by the feds. They had all kinds of elaborate methods of hiding the bar. You push a button and all the liquor drops through the floor. Shit did not happen in Kansas City. We just... kept the party rocking, and that's just, I mean, say what you will about corruption, but when it happens, just so. Not only did Kansas City start attracting players, it started attracting the best players, and it became highly competitive. And before long, not everybody was good enough to play in KC. You know, not everybody was good enough to play in KC, famously. Charlie Parker had to leave because he couldn't get work because he wasn't good enough. They said, "Kid, you got to get out. You got to get out. You got to learn something." And he left town and he found a mentor and he found work and he got in a band and he learned how to play and he went out and he started learning as much as he could. And by the time he came back, he was blowing minds as hard as he was blowing sax. There was already a legacy of great piano players in Kansas City in the students and descendants of those old brothel piano players. So Casey's musical genetic makeup was already stronger than most places, and the air of competition only made it more so. Now we've arrived at a fork in the road that veers off in many directions, but all the rivers and tributaries of the music of the 20th century now flow from Kansas City. New Orleans is widely recognized as the birthplace of jazz, and that's true to a certain extent. But Kansas City played a much bigger part than people have any idea. For one thing, when Charlie Parker was run out of town for not being good enough, he went to work with a vengeance. That's Miles. Went to vengeance with his friend Dizzy Gillespie, and they started about creating a thing called bebop. And bebop changed everything. Bebop changed how the entire planet looked at how you could approach music, how you could approach tonality, how you could approach melody. Charlie Parker's beautiful brain absolutely set that off. And he needed a place where he could blow without anybody making demands on his music. And that started here and on the Chitlin circuit, but coming back here with guys like Dizzy and blowing with bands around town. And they needed that kind of freedom they could only find in the wide open saloons of Kansas City, where nobody who was running the show really knew about music, except for the guys on stage seemed to know what they're doing. They're keeping the people dancing, and the people dancing are buying the hooch, so let's keep this rolling and not mess with the stuff. Many of those innovations, they needed... This is a story, again, that I could spend hours telling, but we have to move on because we need to talk about swing music for just a second. And if I can just show you this picture here. Where did he go? It's a big picture. I'll find it in a second.
You're doing great.
Oh, thanks. Well, there's a cat whose name is, I swear I had it just right here. Well, his name is Jesse Stone. And Jesse Stone wrote Shake, Rattle, and Roll under the name of Charles Calhoun because there was simply a different way that you wrote music back then. You wrote it under different affiliations, different, whether you were writing for BMI or whether you were writing for ASCAP, it made a difference because one was for highbrow music and one was for lowbrow music like rock and roll or beat music or race records, which is straight up what they called them at the time. The race records, which is what Joe Turner was making and Jesse Stone was making. Jesse Stone, there's an argument that can be made that he invented swing music with the invention of horn charts. That he is the guy who was the first guy. No, let's get everybody's their separate chart. And before that, everybody was working with head sheets and just like, okay, we're going to blow in B, and then we're going to go to the 5. And, you know, there was general musical instruction, but charting everything out for each individual section and player was an innovation of Jesse Stone's. And Jesse Stone, that would not have swing music would not have been possible had Jesse Stone not done that. Now, I could talk about Jesse Stone forever, but in the relevance to tonight's topic, we're have to talk about. I'm going to skip ahead. He became the first black record executive at a major label for Atlantic. In the 20s, Count Basie called him the best piano player in Kansas City, which was really saying something at the time. Now, yeah, right? Now, Jesse Stone is extremely important because of our purposes here, because KC was the birthplace of one innovation that, in my opinion, was the most important of the entire 20th century, which is the backbeat. And rock and roll gave us the backbeat gave us rock and roll. Now, many places, people and places lay claim to invention, innovation, and birthplace of rock and roll. Many have strong claims, but the one thing Kansas City has over all of them is the backbeat. Before the backbeat, jazz had started to venture into several different varieties: ragtime, Dixieland, blues, boogie woogie. Some people say that rock and roll was the result of country music mixing with black music, and that's part of the story. Others say that rock and roll was just rebranded boogie woogie, and that's also part of the story. Most of the other origin stories have a grain of truth to them, but what really happened is music evolved as musicians traveling from one place to another looking for work. A cat from NOLA might move northward looking for and wind up in Memphis or Mississippi. There they might show each other what they know, then they moved westward. And westward was Kansas City, because there was opportunity to work, to ply your craft your way. And every region had their own style, and the thing they were doing in Kansas City that they weren't doing in other places was drums. Now, lots of bands all across the country had drums, but in Kansas City they did something really, really remarkable. They dumbed it down. No, they stuck it in a box. Boom, bap, boom, bap, boom, bap, boom, bap, boom, bap. Before that, jazz had tended to swing in a free way from the drums played like a melodic instruments. There was the shuffle of boogie woogie, dooba 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 dooba. It swings. But this Kansas City took the structure of the blues and boogie woogie and it gave it hard corners that people couldn't help but dance to. The first backbeat on record is a song called Rollin' Pete by Big Joe Turner. This recording doesn't feature drums because the one thing Kansas City did not have was any recording studios. They made the record in New York after the famous Spirituals to Swing concert, another story. But where the beat is emphasized in the measure is unmistakably a backbeat in Rollin' Pete. This record shook up the world, and for years before they recorded it, they'd been sending it out on a 5 a.m. broadcast. People like Joe Turner, Pete Johnson, Jesse Stone, Mary Lou Williams, Count Basie, Benny Moten, all of these people were sending the backbeat across the country after they got done with their bar sets. They'd head to a radio station at 5 a.m., sending out 50,000 watts of AM power. And at 5 a.m. in the morning, the airwaves weren't cluttered and the signal could reach New York. And when the swing bands of Harlem were getting done with their gigs and they beat it home to hear the latest sounds of jump blues from Kansas City, that's where they went because that's where it was going down. Jump blues, with its dumbed-down backbeat, was derided by many as jungle music, music for simpletons, music for cretins and people of low character, but that didn't stop it from spreading and fast, which is what created the difference between ASCAP and BMI. Rollin' Pete is still considered by many to be the first rock and roll song. Now, in my opinion, it's still a bit sophisticated musically. It doesn't have the drums, but again, that's only because it was recorded in New York while Turner and Johnson were there. But even without the drums, Rollin' Pete contained one of the earliest examples of the backbeat, its use of straight rhythm. Well into the 50s, most if not all similar recordings were played in a shuffle rhythm. Turner later recorded many other versions with various combinations of musicians over the ensuing years, particularly in the 1950s when he became a star of rock and roll, and his Down This Road retraced the true origins of rock and roll to Kansas City. The backbeat spread like wildfire because it made people dance. It told them where to step and how to move. It was a populist movement because it simplified the arrangements. It cut down the number of people you needed to have in a band. It cut down the amount of skill you needed to be able to play this kind of music. It was music by the people and for the people, and not just people with musical educations. It could be played by people with just enough ability to accompany themselves, and it could make room for people that have a real good time. Kind of sounds a little bit like punk, doesn't it? So this is a story. Remember, punk? I just can't talk about that. This is a story that I could talk about for days. We're almost back to the loft in the River Key. Backtracking just a bit, Tom Pendergast eventually died, and the power vacuum he left was taken over by the mafia, who controlled this city from the 1950s through the 1980s, when there was a gangland war that culminated in a series of murders, bodies being found in trunks and washing up on the banks of the Missouri River, and eventually the bombings of two popular night spots in the River Key. Through the 70s and 80s, the Key had been growing as a popular entertainment district until this set of revenge bombings happened and the fun was done. The area shut down and essentially became the sad, hollow, literally bombed out area that I had described earlier. There was nothing there except for a few warehouses, a strip club, some homeless camps, and some rubble. You could still see the burned timbers of the bars that had been blown to bits. And this gets us up to the 80s, still a few years before I come on the scene. But this is where the rubber really starts to hit the road for punk and underground music. Clubs like the Epitaph, the Music Box, the Fool Killer. Oh, man. Oh, sorry about that. I'm just going to start showing some of these, going through these as I can. So many great, I found just a wonderful trove of these shows that were happening in Kansas City. At the Fool Killer Parody Hall, the Downliner started hosting bands like the Tunnel Dogs and the Vomitones, the Gear, the Orange Donuts, Duchamp, the Mortal Micronauts, and the Slabs, a band whose membership would contain my fellow archivist Joey Slab, to whom I owe a great deal for a lot of these pictures and stories. A guy named, let's see, where is he here? A guy named, some of you might know, Motley. Did anybody know Motley at all? Okay, well, the reason why the Crossroads is because of Motley. Motley was a punk rocker and artist. He was the lead singer of a band called Mudhead. But he was the frontiersman who went down to that area and said, I'm going to start an art gallery here and a practice space. And he did, and he became a champion of arts for the rest of his life. He had one leg, and he'd hold his leg up at punk rock shows. If you were doing good, you saw Motley's leg, and I was like, oh, you saw Motley's leg, man. Yeah, it's a good night. Motley, who started Mudhead, and he one of the main, Archer Pruitt was in that band, who's now a prominent Chicago visual artist. And now we're back to the fall of '88, or at least near it. That young man I'd mentioned earlier, named Paul Malinowski, had been on the lookout for a place for his band Curious George to live and practice, found a building at 3rd and Delaware, and this place simply became called The Loft. They put in a stage, a PA, and started having bands play, and I started going as often as I could. There was punk rock happening elsewhere nearby, of course. I'd heard of the infamous Outhouse, the small cinder block shack in the middle of a cornfield that tons of legendary bands played at. Fishbone, Nirvana, with some friends of mine, Piston Grind played. DRI, COC, all of these people were there for the night that the crowd beat up DRI. And there was really like 11 people there, but like everybody was there that night, right? Dozens of other bands played there before there was somebody. There was the Fool Killer, where Einsters into Neubauten played, and my girlfriend, is she here? There she is. She got hit with a broken glass that Blixa Bargeld from Einsters into Neubauten, the German industrial band, they were throwing broken glass all night. She got hit with some glass. She was underage. She shouldn't have been there.
It was Parody Hall.
It was Parody Hall? Yeah, that's okay. There we go. Nice. Thank you. I was too young to get in there. I didn't get in, and I wasn't pretty like her. They didn't let me in. Same with the Epitaph. I couldn't get in. Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds played at the VFW. And the Dead Kennedys played at the VFW. The Replacements, Elvis Costello, and the Police played at 1 block west before we'd ever heard of them. But I could get into the Loft. The space which was a basement beneath a nail salon at 47th and Troost. Across from the street from the KFC now sits I Saw Mongol Beach Party with Big Red Fish. There were basement shows, punk rock shows. Punk rock grows out of Pendergast concrete like weeds. You can pluck it, you can spray for it, you can pave it over, but it just comes back. And when there weren't shows, punks and other subculture weirdos like us would gather on the back steps of the Nelson Art Gallery. So a couple people, and just hang out, listen to whatever tapes somebody remembered to bring a boombox would play. Some nights we took over the riverfront and we'd climb the ASB Bridge. Like I said, it was a ghost town. It seems that once again KC was wide open. It was a Wild West, a lawless town. We could do whatever we wanted. It was deserted after 6 p.m. That meant cops too, and we ran wild like coyotes. Then came the glorious Amnesty International concert in Volker Park. There was always a history of concerts in Volker Park, but there was the Amnesty International concert that happened in Volker Park, and this is a picture of the Psycho Welders, actually, and it's one of the most beautiful days I've ever experienced. That was the day I discovered the incomparable Sin City Disciples, who opened this show. If you were part of that, that was one of their gigs in 1990. The Sin City Disciples were a revelation. They absolutely blew my mind. Groove and boogie and blues-based rock and roll that sounded like it was the literal outgrowth of what Big Joe Turner would have become. You know, it was the basic evolution of what Big Joe Turner's Kansas City Stomp would eventually, inevitably, morph into. Ernie Locke blowing his harmonica like it was a tornado siren. Duck and cover, Twister's coming. Sin City eventually broke up, but for a while they were the brightest shining beacon of hope for many of us young rockers. There was talk that they were getting signed and that they were going to put Casey's underground scene on the map. They were in my little circles. They were the leaders of the pack. In '89, things started changing, and that was the year that a little band called Nirvana played at the Outhouse, and things really, really, really started changing. They had an EP out called Bleats that was making waves, and in '91 I remember seeing the video for Smells Like Teen Spirit for the first time. And the whole world went again from from black and white to color. Not because Teen Spirit was that good. On the contrary, to me, at the time, I thought it was just okay. But the revelatory part, and I remember thinking this exact sentence in my mind, was wild. They're letting shitty punk rock bands on MTV in the middle of the afternoon now. And I only say shitty because they really weren't that different from anything that they were, or better, or anything different than any bands that I was going to see here in town were doing, or bands that I was actually playing in, for that matter, were doing. Now, I will cop to being a bit delusional, and it's clear that Nirvana really did have something special. But again, it wasn't the quality of what they were doing, it's simply what they were doing that was mind-blowing. Before then, the only thing wild and noisy you got on MTV at that time, when it was still music videos 24 hours a day, late Sunday night, 2 hours, a show called 120 Minutes. The fact that these dirty, sarcastic assholes were allowed any access to the airwaves at all was a point of no return. Just a few years earlier, I'd seen a group called the Red Hot Chili Peppers open for Fishbone. And now, these naked yahoos were suddenly jumping all around everyone's television. People I knew and bands that I'd seen were starting to get real record deals. The Loft stopped having shows. They had careers to get on with. The Space on Truce got torn down. Nine Lives and Curious George morphed into a band called Season to Risk. They got a van, they hit the road. Years later, I would be on tour with a band of my own and somewhere reading Spin magazine, and I would see an article talking about something called the Kansas City Sound. And by this, they meant specifically Season to Risk and a few other bands. I think they mentioned Molly Maguire, Giant's Chair, and Shiner. In the 1990 season of Saturday Night Live, a flyer for the Pedaljets featuring L7 in smaller print would be featured in the opening credits of Saturday Night Live during the cast parade. Share UK, Kill Creek, Tenderloin were all getting major label deals. Tenderloin was on tour with Megadeth and Soundgarden. This was really going on, and it's highly likely that this sort of scenario led to my own personal belief that I could make it in the record business. The local music scene had gone from cover bands in bars to original bands in basements and loft, and any place they could get power or install a generator. And suddenly, original punk music was being allowed into the bars, Davies Uptown became a mecca for punk rock, The Shadow, The Hurricane, Lawrence Off the Wall Hall, later The Bottleneck, and we were entering a golden age. The Pedaljets got to tour with Husker Du and opened for the Replacements at Memorial Hall. Both the Mats and the Huskers had embodied the hard drinking and hard playing Midwestern DIY ethic. The Pedaljets and Share UK were part of a scene that ran up and down the I-35 corridor from the Twin Cities to Austin, Texas. Bands like the Flaming Lips and the Butthole Surfers were almost as much a fixture in our town as our own players. I'm actually in the Pedaljets now. I'm the young kid in the band. The band was formed in 1982. I joined in 2012. Sometimes if you like a band enough, you end up in it. But that was my story. I didn't go away. I got to know everyone I could who was involved with making things happen because I wanted to be someone who made things happen too. I never really wanted to be famous. I just wanted to be a Kansas City star. That level of fame, yeah, right? Well, it's real. That level of fame was cool with me because that's where my respect for music stemmed from, Kansas City, a place where people went and did the thing. And they didn't let anything stop them. Nobody here in Kansas City was going to discover you or give you a record deal. You had to get out on the road and show them who you were if you wanted that. Thing was, record company suits weren't preying upon every little band that came out of here. Bands formed without the notion of ever making it. They were formed knowing that their audience would be mostly made of their friends and other bands. Consequently, bands in Kansas City ended up making music for two reasons: to please themselves and to impress the other bands. David Geffen wasn't going to show up, so you didn't have to worry about what was marketable or what the people wanted. You could do your own thing, whatever that was. That led to some serious weirdness, like New Wave Dave and his daily medication. It's not for everybody, but the Big Four, loud-sounding dreams, bands weren't afraid to experiment because they had nothing to lose. The spirit of wide openness combined with his distance from places that are thought of as cosmopolitan. The corruption, the desolation of the urban landscape, the reclamation of neglected buildings and neighborhoods by artists. These things happen everywhere, but in Kansas City, they happen in a very unique and specific way that produces, and always has produced, challenging and innovative music that is generally of higher quality than most cities of its size and similar demographic. In fact, I'd put Kansas City up against any city anywhere. Maybe Athens, Seattle, New York CBGBs, and LA in their heydays can compete, but apart from those, I'd put our local underground music scene up against anybody with confidence. Right now, there's a podcast called The History of Rock and Roll in 500 Songs, and it's great. But the first dozen episodes, it mentions people like Jesse Stone and Joe Turner and Pete Johnson and about a dozen others, and it doesn't say anything about them being from Kansas City other than the fact that those people were from here. And it seems strange to me that nobody is more curious to find out what it is about this town that produced and grew these beautiful musical minds. There are a lot of things that tie punk and underground music to Kansas City's sordid and storied music history, and it's my current passion project to collect the entirety of that story and bring it to an audience that maybe is unaware of just how important Kansas City is to everything. These are the stories that I'm going to be attempting to uncover and show to the world through the Kansas City sound. I'd like to thank Sophie Williams for asking me to be here, and Steve and Leslie and all of the team who have been real nice to me here and helping me put this together.
Real quick, we do have a little bit of time for Q&A. Unfortunately, we only have time for 2 in person,
Okay.
just because we are a few hairs past 7. I do have one quick online question, and then we can have our 2
Hit me.
anointed. It's sad that Jesse Stone didn't get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame until 2010.
2010.
2010.
It's absolutely, it's not surprising, but yes, it is terrible. It is terrible that he didn't.
Well, there's a question. Why do you think it took so long to be recognized?
Racism. I mean, that's the easy answer, is racism. Jesse Stone, who wrote songs under the name of Charles Calhoun, he wrote his rock and roll songs under the name of Charles Calhoun. because of writer differences, was a black man. He wasn't a performer apart from being a piano player. He made some records with his records with his band Jesse Stone and the House Rockers. By the way, the House Rockers became Louis Jordan's band. Louis Jordan, who is often credited as the creator of rock and roll, stole Jesse Stone's band, and that was his band. It became from the House Rockers. But yeah, overlooking behind the scenes people and simple racism is why Jesse Stone didn't get in sooner, is what I think.
Yeah. Purpose questions, please come up to the microphones.
Or if Cody's okay, you can repeat it.
Or that.
Yeah.
Hello, I haven't seen you in 20 years. My name's Heather Fiziak. It would have been Heather Bashaw at the time.
Hi,
or
Heather.
Heavy Frequency magazine.
Yeah, hi, Heather. Yeah.
So it was good to see your name.
It's been a while.
So I was curious if you have any thoughts about the arrival of modern media like the internet or internet zines and magazines to Kansas City's music community.
Yeah, it's absolutely wild what happened with it when the new media started to happen in the early 21st century. When I kind of came back on the scene again after an illness in 2003, it was really amazing to see the great work that the internet made as a community through a place called the Zone, thezone.org, the forum, where I know there's like 3 people here who I met through the Zone, and people were making zines and were talking about shows and promoting shows online, and it created a community that previously paper zines had filled, and it was hugely important. It was massively important. MySpace was such a big deal, and I remember reading so much great rock criticism from you and so many other people in this room. I think Danny Alexander might be in here. There was a lot of great rock criticism that was happening in those days of the early internet, and it's changed a lot recently. It is not the same as it was, and I don't know if I'm qualified to speak to that because I'm not sure I know what's happening anymore with that. Hi.
Hi, good evening. I don't really have a question.
Okay.
I have a request.
Okay.
Is it a possibility that you can do a part 2?
Oh, well, thank you. That's entirely up to the people here. But I would love to. I would love to is the short answer, and I am trying to condense this into a consumable form, hopefully a podcast called The Kansas City Sound. I do have a Facebook page and an Instagram that's kind of set up, updates my progress a little bit here and there that's going with that. Hopefully I will release that and you can get more of the story there, but I'm certainly open to that. Thank you very much.
Let's do this one last question.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's what I was kind of gonna ask. If you had any of this like posted online anywhere or something.
Any of this posted online?
The presentation.
No, I don't. But I think tonight's presentation was live streamed. Yes. And can probably be listened to through an archive.
Mm-hmm. This is already currently available live on YouTube. Yeah.
I took a lot of my a lot of these pictures. I had so many to go through. Maybe we can just turn this back. Maybe Leslie, you can turn this back to a slideshow as everybody's leaving or something. I didn't get to show all of the pictures that I want because I actually ended up on salient points. What was that? Save it for part 2. Well, part 2, I'll have a clicker. I'll know what I'm doing next time, right? Yeah. Okay. So, thank you so very much. This has been a delight. Thank you very much.
Real quick, the live stream is ending, but I do want to just throw out that a lot of the sheet music that Cody mentioned earlier in his talk is available in our special collections department across